Story 1. Story 1, The Cabin. The crisp mountain air bit at my cheeks, a stark contrast to the stuffy car. My wife, Sarah, our 6-year-old daughter, Lily, and I had been driving for hours, escaping the city's smothering heat for a week in a secluded cabin. Lily, ever the restless passenger, was finally asleep, her head lolling against the window. The GPS blinked, announcing our arrival. The cabin was nestled deeper in the woods than I'd imagined, the long dirt road twisting and turning until asphalt was a distant memory. It looked exactly like the pictures online, rustic, charming, isolated. Perfect. We unloaded the car, the silence broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the distant whisper of wind through the pines. The first 2 days were idyllic. Hiking, fishing in the nearby stream, roasting marshmallows under a sky dusted with stars. Lily was in her element, chasing butterflies and collecting smooth, grey stones. It was exactly the escape we needed. Then, the quiet started to feel different. Heavy. Oppressive. It began with the whispers. Faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of leaves just beyond my hearing. I dismissed it at first, attributing it to the wind, the settling of the old cabin. But it persisted. Sarah heard it too. We exchanged uneasy glances, both pretending it was nothing. Then came the shadows. Flickering movements at the edge of my vision. I'd turn, expecting to see a deer or a squirrel, but there'd be nothing. The feeling of being watched became a constant companion. I started locking the doors, even during the day, a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. One evening, while Sarah was reading Lily a bedtime story, I stepped out onto the porch. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something acrid, metallic. My gaze swept the surrounding woods, the darkness pressing in. That's when I saw it. A figure. Tall, slender, standing motionless at the edge of the trees. It was too dark to make out any features, but I knew, with chilling certainty, that it was watching us. I stumbled back inside, heart hammering against my ribs. Sarah looked up, her eyes wide with concern. "What is it?" she whispered. "Nothing," I lied, my voice shaking. "Just the wind." I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through me. The whispers seemed louder now, closer, weaving themselves into disturbing fragments of conversation. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was menacing, accusatory. The next morning, Lily refused to go outside. "There's a bad man in the woods, Daddy," she said, her small voice trembling. I tried to reassure her, telling her it was just her imagination, but even as the words left my mouth, I didn't believe them. That afternoon, we discovered strange symbols carved into the bark of a tree near the cabin. Crude, unsettling shapes that looked like a twisted language. They weren't there before. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. We had to leave. Packing was frantic, fueled by a desperate need to escape. As I loaded the last of our belongings into the car, I glanced back at the cabin. The curtains in one of the upstairs windows twitched. I knew, with a sickening certainty, that we were not alone. We drove away, leaving the cabin and the oppressive silence of the woods behind. The relief, however, was short-lived. Lily, normally a chatterbox, remained silent, staring out the window with a disturbingly blank expression. Sarah kept glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, her hand gripping mine so tightly it hurt. That night, in the sterile safety of a motel room, I lay awake, listening. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent, following us. And then, I heard something else. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. I didn't look. I couldn't. I pulled the covers over my head. We never spoke about the cabin again. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I still hear the whispers. And I wonder, what was it we left behind in those woods? And what, exactly, followed us home? Story 2. Story 2, The Whispering Pines. My wife, Sarah, and I desperately needed a break. The city was grinding us down. So we rented a cabin tucked deep in the Adirondacks. Secluded, rustic charm, the brochure promised, and it delivered. The closest town was a 40-minute drive down a winding, pothole-riddled road, and the cabin itself was nestled amongst towering pines that blocked out almost all sunlight. It was perfect. The first few days were blissful. We hiked, canoed on the glassy lake, and spent evenings reading by the crackling fireplace. The air was crisp, laced with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The silence, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call, was a balm to our frayed nerves. It was on the fourth day that things started to shift. I woke in the night to a low, whispering sound. At first, I thought it was Sarah talking in her sleep, but when I turned over, she was sound asleep, her face pale in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. The whispering continued, a sibilant murmur that seemed to come from just outside the cabin walls. I listened intently, my heart pounding. It sounded like voices, multiple voices, overlapping and indistinct, carried on the wind. I got out of bed, cautiously approached the window, and peered out into the darkness. The pines swayed gently, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers. There was nothing there. I told myself it was just the wind, the trees creaking in the night, and went back to bed. The next day, the whispering was gone, but a new unease had settled over me. The forest, once a source of tranquility, now felt oppressive, watchful. The pines seemed to loom over us, their dark needles casting long, distorted shadows. Sarah noticed my change in mood. "Everything okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "Yeah, just tired," I lied. That night, the whispering returned, louder this time, closer. It sounded like it was coming from right outside our bedroom window. I could almost make out words, fragments of sentences, but they were garbled, unintelligible. Sarah woke up. "What is that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. I grabbed my phone and called the park ranger station. There was no answer. No signal. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in bed, listening to the whispers that seemed to seep into the very walls of the cabin. The following morning, we packed our bags. The sense of dread was palpable, a thick, suffocating blanket. We had to leave. As we were driving away, I glanced back at the cabin, swallowed by the shadows of the pines. I saw a flicker of movement in the trees, something dark and indistinct. I turned away, my stomach churning. Back in the city, the whispers faded, replaced by the familiar cacophony of urban life. But the unease remained, a lingering sense of being watched, of being followed. We tried to put it behind us, to rationalize it, but we couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us home from the woods. Weeks later, I found an old newspaper article tucked away in a drawer at the cabin. It detailed a series of unexplained disappearances in the area, dating back decades. All the victims had been vacationers, staying in remote cabins. The article mentioned strange whispers heard in the woods, attributed to local folklore and superstition. I haven't been able to sleep properly since. The whispers are back, fainter now, but still there, lurking at the edges of my consciousness. Sometimes, when the wind blows through the city streets, I hear them again, carried on the breeze, a chilling reminder of our vacation in the whispering pines. And then I see it, a fleeting shadow in the periphery of my vision, something dark and indistinct, watching me from the corner of my eye. I know, deep down, that whatever was in those woods, it's not finished with us yet. It's waiting. And it's whispering. Just last night, Sarah woke me, her face pale and drawn. "I heard it," she whispered, her voice trembling. The whispering. "It's in the house." I listened intently, straining my ears against the silence of the night. At first, I heard nothing. Then, a faint rustle, a sibilant murmur, seemed to drift from the hallway outside our bedroom door. It grew louder, closer, until it filled the room, a chorus of whispers, cold and malevolent. I reached for my phone, but my hand froze. The whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a new sound, a scratching, like fingernails on wood, coming from inside the wall, right behind my head. We're not alone. And I don't know what to do. Story 3. Story 3, The Empty Coast. The salt-laced wind whipped my hair across my face, tasting of freedom and the promise of escape. My husband, David, squeezed my hand, his thumb tracing small, reassuring circles. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he murmured, his voice barely audible above the crashing waves. We'd rented a secluded cottage on the Oregon coast, a desperate attempt to rekindle the dying embers of our marriage. The brochure promised dramatic cliffs, secluded beaches, and utter tranquility. It delivered on all counts, perhaps a little too effectively. The cottage itself was perched precariously on a bluff overlooking the churning grey Pacific. It was charming in a rustic, slightly unsettling way, all dark wood and dusty windows. The nearest town was a 40-minute drive along a winding, pothole-ridden road, a fact that initially excited me with its promise of isolation but soon began to gnaw at the edges of my comfort. The first few days were pleasant. We hiked along the deserted beaches, the only sound the rhythmic crash of waves and the distant cries of gulls. We cooked simple meals, read books, and talked, really talked, for the first time in months. A fragile hope began to bloom in my chest. Then, the fog rolled in. It started subtly, a thin veil clinging to the horizon. By evening, it had swallowed the coastline whole, a thick, oppressive blanket that muffled sound and swallowed light. The rhythmic crashing of the waves became a distant, unsettling moan. That night, I woke to a scratching sound. I sat up in bed, straining my ears in the oppressive silence. David slept soundly beside me, oblivious. The scratching came again, seemingly from just outside our window. I crept out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, and peered cautiously through the glass. Nothing. Only the swirling fog, illuminated by the faint, ghostly glow of the moon. I returned to bed, dismissing it as a branch against the glass, but a knot of unease had taken root in my stomach. The next morning, the fog remained, clinging to the landscape like a shroud. The scratching returned that night, and the night after, always when the fog was thickest. I began to see things in the periphery of my vision, fleeting glimpses of movement in the swirling grey. David, ever practical, attributed it to the isolation, the fog playing tricks on my mind. But I knew, deep down, that something was wrong. One afternoon, driven by a restless anxiety, I decided to explore the beach. David was engrossed in a book, seemingly content to remain within the confines of the cottage. The fog was thick, reducing visibility to a few feet. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and something else, something faintly metallic, that made my stomach churn. I walked for what felt like hours, the only sound the crunch of sand beneath my feet and the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn. Then, I saw it. A small, wooden boat, half buried in the sand. It was ancient, its wood blackened and splintered by the relentless sea. A single, rusted oar lay beside it, half submerged in the sand. As I approached, I noticed a shape huddled in the bottom of the boat. My heart pounded in my chest. I knelt down, peering into the gloom. It was a figure, wrapped in a thick, dark cloth. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the fabric. It was cold, damp, and strangely stiff. A wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt leaden, rooted to the spot. I forced myself to look again, to try and make sense of what I was seeing. But the fog, swirling around the boat like a restless spirit, obscured the details. Then, I heard it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a voice of utter despair, a sound that resonated with the deepest, darkest parts of my soul. I turned and ran, blindly, through the fog, the whispering voice echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached the cottage, slamming the door shut behind me and bolting it securely. David looked up from his book, his face etched with concern. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice laced with alarm. I tried to tell him, to explain what I'd seen, what I'd heard, but the words caught in my throat. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Pity, perhaps? Or something colder, something more distant. That night, the scratching returned, louder than ever, accompanied by the faint, mournful whisper. I lay in bed, rigid with terror, listening as the sounds grew closer, circling the cottage like predators stalking their prey. David slept beside me, his breathing slow and even. I wanted to wake him, to seek comfort in his presence, but something held me back. A growing, unsettling feeling that I was utterly, irrevocably alone. The next morning, the fog was gone. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the coastline in all its stark, desolate beauty. David was gone too. His side of the bed was empty, the sheets cold. I called his name, my voice echoing through the empty cottage, but there was no reply. I searched the cottage, the beach, the surrounding cliffs, but found no trace of him. He had simply vanished. As if he had never been there at all. The car was still in the driveway, the keys in the ignition. His phone lay on the bedside table, next to an open book. Everything was exactly as he had left it. Except he wasn't there. I stood on the cliff overlooking the ocean, the wind whipping my hair across my face, tasting of salt and something else, something faintly metallic. The sun glinted off the surface of the water, blindingly bright, yet offering no illumination, no answers. The waves crashed against the rocks below, their rhythmic roar a constant, unsettling reminder of the vast, indifferent power of the sea. I am still here, in the cottage, waiting. Waiting for David, waiting for an explanation, waiting for the fog to return. The scratching has stopped, but the whispering remains, a constant presence in the back of my mind, a chilling reminder of the unseen horrors that lurk just beyond the veil of reality. And in the silence, I hear the ocean breathing, waiting.